Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to talk about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and communism. So this is going to be a little different than we've talked about in here so far. In this section where we concentrated on ethics. Ethics is the study of what is good and bad and right and wrong. We have talked about three fundamental approaches to moral realism. We looked at utilitarianism, we looked at Kantianism, and we looked at Aristotle's theory of virtue ethics, right? So we are going to change, today's is a bit of a change up. Instead of looking at the three fundamental disagreements about what the word good means, today we are going to visit very quickly, we're going to fly by a different wing of ethics. We're going to dip a toe in the branch of ethics that looks at political philosophy, that looks at questions about what kind of society we should have, and what the relationship is what the proper relationship is between the individual and the government, and the individual and the society generally, right? To do that, we are going to look at we're going to talk about Marxism today. So Marx is pissed off. He's angry, right? What is he so mad about? Well, in a word, capitalism. What is capitalism? Well, capitalism is a socioeconomic theory. My notes right here. A socioeconomic theory based on the private ownership of property, right? The idea here is that I, as an individual, I can go out, I can buy some property, and then I can use that however I like, right? I go out and I buy a house. That house now, and then we have a good real estate transfer. That house now belongs to me. I can rent it out if I want. I can rent out the upstairs to college students. I can burn it down for the insurance money. No, I shouldn't do that. I can burn it down if I want and start to build a new house, right? The house is mine, belongs to me, right? If my property values go up and I sell my house, I keep the difference, right? This is true of houses. It's true of comic books. Back in 1992, 1991, I bought a comic book for $1.25. A couple years ago, I sold that comic. It turns out that comic book, New Mutants 98, had the first appearance of a character named Deadpool. A couple years, I sold that comic book for about $300, right? So who gets that money? This guy, right? I put down the initial investment. It was my property. If it goes up in value, I receive the benefits. On the contrary, of course, if it goes down in value, if my property value falls, I take the loss, right? So our basic system here in the United States and the West generally is one of capitalism. Individuals can own things, private individuals can own things without the government's permission, and they can freely trade between each other. They can freely trade their stuff between each other, right? Some people think that, well, obviously individuals should be able to buy and own stuff. It's funny, there's even a word for that, right? Of course, capitalism is obviously the right way to go, the right thing, the right system to have. This is not so obvious to some people. It historically has not been obvious to previous generations, and it's not obvious to Marx and Engels, right? So let's talk about what happened before capitalism came along. Well, if you go back a really long time ago, even some places today, very few around the world today, but a long time ago, there was, back in the times of kings and queens, back in the time of what's called feudalism, there wasn't capitalism, at least not in the form that we know it today. If you go back under feudalism, that is a socioeconomic theory that emphasized the importance of having the blessing of the king to own anything. Back during feudalism, if this is our country, the feudalism is a socioeconomic system based on the titled nobility. So there's the king and the nobility at the top of the government, and then there is a second class of human beings, and these are the peasants. All these go by a few different names, and depending on the where you are in the world. But that's the basic split. There is the people who have the power and have the right to own things, and then there are the peasants. How this works out is, if this is our country, when the king comes into power, that country gets divided up into little counties or little shires or little sub-kingdoms or whatever, right? And the king owns the whole land. And then he allows his family members and his generals that he really likes, he gives them a title. He calls them the Lord of whatever and puts them in charge of these little counties, right? The king rules over them. The lords rule over the counties, right? The lords own everything in the county with the permission of the king. And what the lord does then is he passes his ownership on to the peasants, the people, right? So how I do this in classes, I make myself the king, or the titled noble, and my students are my subjects. They are the peasants, right? And so what I do for a living is, I'm the Lord, right? And you will have to do what I say. And what I'm going to do out of the kindness of my heart is I'm going to allow you all to have a little plot of land, maybe have a little farm so you can raise some carrots and some turnips. Maybe if you want to make candles or be a blacksmith or something like that, I'll allow that too, right? But you have to understand that all the stuff that you own or you claim to own, that ends when I say it ends. If I decide I need some of your turnips, or if I decide I need some of your candles or your swords, I take them, right? And what happens under feudalism is the king demands a tribute from all of his lords, and the lords pay him by taxing the peasants, right? So the peasants have to pay a certain tax to be able to work on their little farms or make their candles, right? This is out of a recognition that really you don't own anything, you peasants. You're just renting the land and the ways of making candles and swords and so on. You're just renting that from me, your lord, right? So you have to pay to exist, right, in the form of taxation. Also, an important part of feudalism is whenever the lord says, "Hey, put down your carrots and your candles, and let's all go to war to invade one of these other counties or invade some foreign land," you all have to do that because you have to do what I say, right? And we all have to do what the king says. So under feudalism is a system of deciding at the end of the day, especially how Marx sees it. Feudalism is a system first and foremost about deciding who owns what, right? Who has the right to own stuff. And the answer from feudalism is, the titled nobility has the rights to own stuff. The peasants don't really have any rights, right? Now, what happened? So this is not a system. Feudalism is not a system that's based on the rights of individuals, private individuals, to own private property. Over here, to own any property, you need the blessing of the Lord. You need a title, right? So, what happens to feudalism? I'm about to give a version of history that is Marx's version of history. If you've taken a world history class, you might know that there are other ways of kind of slicing this pie, right? But the story of history that Marx tells is this: that feudalism faces a crisis a few hundred years ago, right? And the crisis is that the king and the nobility are running out of money. They're running out of stuff, right? So what happens is that they begin to raise the taxes on the peasants, and they begin to demand more and more of the average citizens, right? And so what happens is these two social classes begin to rub up against each other, right? They come into conflict. The king has no other way of making money besides increasing taxes on the peasants, and they have no other way to no other way to live than the peasants have no choice but to pay those taxes, right? And another thing comes along that so here's an important sort of addendum to the relationship between the titled nobility and the peasants. The Lord, out of the kindness of my heart, I'm going to say, okay, you carrot farmers, tell you what, after you're done paying your taxes, any carrots that are left over, you can take those down into the city square, down to the market, and you can trade those to other people, maybe for cash. And tell you what, buy yourself something nice, on me, because I'm so kind, right? So as taxes go up, the amount left over for the peasants might be little or less and less, right? Well, what happens during the period of the Industrial Revolution is something very interesting. There are innovations in industry. There are innovations rather in technology that allow people to, for instance, thresh wheat faster than they used to in mass. There are innovations in farming techniques that allow people to farm a lot more turnips and a lot more carrots than they used to. And what happens is, during this period, is that there begins to be a certain kind of peasant who doesn't have a title, so doesn't really own anything. But at the end of the day, the money that this class of peasant is making down at the market is not negligible. It's no small thing. It becomes more and more and more, right? And this happens at the same time that the king and his nobles are they don't have as much money as they used to. They're kind of running out of cash, right? So what happens to feudalism, in Marx's view, is that these two classes begin to rub against each other, and this friction really ignites whenever there begins to be this emergence of this new kind of peasant, right? There is going to be a middle class that emerges between the nobility and the peasants here. So this middle class is going to be untitled. So under feudalism, they technically don't own anything, but they are going to increasingly have more and more money. The name that is given to this middle class in Marxism goes back to the French word for the city square, which is the burg, right? And this middle class is called the bourgeoisie. So what happens is that there begins to emerge this new class who don't have titles, but they do have a lot of money, right? Eventually what happens is that members of the bourgeoisie, the merchants, right, and the big farmers, right, they begin to think to themselves, the only way the king has to really control them is by raising taxes, right? And eventually the members of the bourgeoisie say, well, why should I keep paying these ever higher taxes? I have a lot of real estate. The king has a lot of real estate. I have guns. He has guns. What if I just don't pay my taxes anymore? And I just say, why is it that I should have all this money but no political power? What if I stop paying my taxes and tell the king to go get bent, right? That I want to be in charge now. And that's what happens. This class of new money, of merchants, the bourgeoisie, begin to question the right of the king to rule them politically, and eventually fight wars to oust the king and to eliminate the king's power from being able to eliminate the king's political control, right? There's no clearer example of this happening than right here in the old US of A, right? If you've taken an American history class, you remember that the big issue for the founding fathers of the United States was that they were, factory owners and plantation owners and businessmen who didn't want to pay their ever-increasing taxes. And the more they pissed the king off and questioned his authority, the more he raised taxes to try to get them in line. And eventually they just said, hell with it. Now it's a shooting war. So then what happened? Well, the Americans won their independence. And then without a king to rule them anymore, what did they do? Well, they established a new system of government, a new socioeconomic system. And that system was one of, from Marx's perspective, that was primarily to preserve capitalism, right? So what happens is feudalism gives way to capitalism. And Marx thinks that any of the loftier ideas that you find in the writings of the Founding Fathers is just window dressing. That these people are not interested in freedom. They're not interested in equality. They're not interested in any of the sort of philosophical. They're not interested in preserving, natural rights. They're or the pursuit of happiness, except as it benefits them. Marx thinks, except as it benefits their class of people, the bourgeoisie. And Marx thinks under this new system, this new American system, all of our political values, all of our moral values, all of our institutions, our religion, the stories we tell our from, Marx thinks all of these are driven by the protection of the bourgeoisie to own their stuff. And that we pay lip service to democracy being the righteous system of governance in our land. But it's, from Marx's perspective, it's a democracy that only reinforces the capitalist system. So it's not really interested in equality. It can't be interested in equality because under capitalism, there still is very clearly a two-tiered system, right? We have thrown out the king, but we have replaced the king and the nobility with the upper economic class and the lower economic class. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So under capitalism, there's still a two-tiered system. There's still the bourgeoisie. There is now the bourgeoisie. These are the landowners, the factory owners, the merchants, and there is the proletariat. These are the people who these are the lower class wage laborers. The only way they have to make a living under capitalism is by selling their labor off an hour at a time, right? They work in the factories, they work in the shops, and they work for the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie can make a living just off of owning stuff in the right way, right? And the proletariat, though, have to work their fingers to the bone, right? Now, we might wonder, well, what's so bad about that? Still, okay, so that's what Marx is upset about, but still not clear why exactly he's so upset about that. Well, from Marx's perspective, this is just as bad in its way as this system. We all know now, intuitively, morally, what was wrong with feudalism. We look back on the feudalist state and we say, wow, how screwed up was that? Somebody lives in the castle just because, somebody pronounced him lord of wherever. And now he just sits around all day doing nothing while people toil away to make carrots and candlesticks to pay taxes to him. How screwed up is that, right? Well, from Marx's perspective, screwed up in exactly the same way for exactly the same reasons that our capitalist system is screwed up. We look back and consider this. We look back on feudalism and we think, wow, the peasants must have hated the king and the lords, right? Not so, Marx is quick to point out. Go back to the time of the peasants, listen to some of their folk songs. They're singing songs about how wonderful the king is, how proud they are of him, how one day they, in their dreams, they would hope to be someday like the king, right? That's screwed up, right? Well, Marx points out that this mentality of the peasants, even as they are being basically enslaved by the nobility, to love their slavers, to worship their slavers. This attitude, as perverse as that seems to us now, Marx wants to point out that's still the attitude we have over here in capitalism. We tell ourselves slightly different stories over here in capitalism, but they're really sort of the same. That we work all day in the factory, and we are told not to think bad of the factory owner. Quite the opposite. Admire him, love him, want to be like him. Someday, maybe you could. If you resent him, well, that's just class warfare. That's just that's class resentment. You're just hating. You're hating him because he's so accomplished. You're hating him because he's such a harder worker than you are, and so on, right? You're hating success. That's a big one, right? So notice how the attitude is the same. It's just the propaganda that has changed. It's just the way we word it that has changed, Marx thinks. Over here, it was about worship the king because he's better than you and he was appointed by God and he has blue blood. Well, all of that's silly. We should worship the people above us because they're the hard workers. They're the rugged individualists. They're the successful people. We should admire them and worship them and want to be like them, right? The essential philosophical problem, though, with capitalism, from Marx's perspective, has to do with what's called the labor theory of value. And the labor theory of value represents why it is that the hostility that Marx has towards capitalism is intractable. There's no way to work it out. The labor theory of value explains why it is that Marx finds capitalism fundamentally, essentially corrupt. There's no way to fix the corruption inherent in capitalism except to destroy it, right? So let's talk about the labor theory of value. Okay, so now let's talk about the labor theory of value. Well, very quickly, the labor theory of value is an economic system. It's actually a family of economic theories, but it's an economic system that emphasizes the role of labor in the creation of value, right? So the labor theory of value is intended to be a general answer to the question of, well, why is it that final products are worth more than the raw materials, right? So consider this. Say that I go down to a swap meet or a flea market, and I buy up some jewels and some little rhinestone jewels and some little necklaces, right? And let's say I pay $10 for the raw materials. Then I come home with those raw materials. I work with them for an hour, making up little necklaces and little ankle chains and so on. Then I go back down to the market next week, and I sell my little necklaces and my anklets for $15, right? So if I have a $15 final product minus $10 that I spent on raw materials, then obviously I have $5 of profit. Right. So my final product is worth $15. The raw materials minus that creates $5 of profit. Now, where did that $5 of profit come from? Right. Well, the labor theory of value says it can only come from that hour that I spent working with the jewels and the to create the necklaces. So it's really plus 1 hour of labor. My marker's kind of running out here. Right. So 1 hour of labor plus results in a $15 product minus the raw materials, and that equals a $5 profit, right? Now, where does that $5 go? Right here. I keep it, right? I can go out and I can buy myself a Big Mac or something, right? Not a Big Mac person, but I could if I wanted, right? So what's wrong with that? I used, I got some raw materials. I used my skills and my hard work to create something. Then I went out and I gave it back to the community, and I was rewarded. What's wrong with that? Well, Marx thinks there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is, in fact, that process of me going out and working with things, using my skills to create things and to turn stuff into things that people want to buy and products that people want and that enrich the lives of the people around me. Not only is there's nothing wrong with that, Marx thinks that is absolutely essential to human beings. We are not going to be well-functioning human beings unless we have this relationship to the world around us and to the people around us. One of using our skills to turn things into turn stuff into things that make people's lives better, right? And see how the things that we make improve the lives of people around us, and be rewarded for the fact, by society for the fact that we have worked to create those things. Marx thinks everything about that is absolutely necessary and proper for human beings to engage in. What happens under capitalism is it totally changes our attitude to that $5 that I got at the end of the day. Under capitalism, if I'm a good capitalist, I don't run out and spend that $5 on something to make me nice, or something nice for myself, right? I don't spend that $5 on I don't put that back into the community to pay somebody else for something that I want. What I do is I go home and I stick that in my piggy bank, right? And I repeat this process for a while until I've saved up enough money, right? And then maybe I go to friends and neighbors and family members and say, hey, I'm printing money. I got this great system. I go down and I buy up all the I buy up these raw materials, these little necklaces and jewels, and I turn them into jewelry, and I'm making money hand over fist. Invest in my little business, right? And then what happens is, if I get enough investors and I save up enough money, I can go back to that flea market next week, and I can buy, rather than $10 worth of raw materials, I say, give me all the rhinestones and all of the little bracelets and so on, right? I spend $1,000 on raw material, right? And now I face, now I'm looking at, with selling final products to the tune of $1,500 and facing a profit of $500. Right? Not only have I cornered the market, nobody else can buy any of the jewels down at the flea market because they all belong to me. But now I'm going to make a huge sum of money, $500, right? But of course, what I need now is I'm going to need what, 100 hours of labor, right? Boy. That sucks. I'm going to get carpal tunnel syndrome from sitting around making up all those necklaces. So here's what I'll do. College students are always looking for money, right? So what I'll do is I'll put up some signs around a campus somewhere and say, hey, come work for my company in my sweatshop, I mean in my little business, I'll pay you $1 an hour, right, to come and work for me, right? And I get some takers on that. Say I get a group of students, and all together they're going to give me 100 hours of labor at $1 an hour, right? So that'll cost me $100, right? So I have to pay them $100 out of my profit. Still, the students come in, they work in my little basement, they put in all of the labor, they have all of the skills that turn the raw materials into the final product. I go out, I sell that final product, I make a profit. Rather than share that profit really with my students, I just come in and pay them off at $1 an hour, and then now there's $400 left over. Where does that money go? It goes into my pocket, right? If I do this bigger, I don't even have to work anymore making necklaces. I can just play golf and sign checks all day, right? And that's the American dream, right? Is to get a business going like this that you no longer have to work at anymore. All you have to do is walk around telling people how hard you used to work and what a great idea you had, right? And your money and the money just increases and increases if your business is successful. Not because you're working hard anymore, right? Quite the opposite. You're not working anymore, but you get the profits in perpetuity forever. Where is the profit coming from? Well, the labor theory of value says the profit is coming from that labor, right? The laborers, the workers, are the ones turning the raw materials into the final product. They are the ones creating the value. And then the capitalist comes in, he throws a little bit of dirty paper at them and says, here, go buy yourself something nice. He takes the final product away, sells it, keeps all the money, right? If it's still not clicking, like morally, what's wrong with that? Think about it this way. Let's say that you are a painter, right? And all you want to do in life is create paintings, right? You have enormous talent and enormous passion for painting, right? But I, Jason, I'm a local wealthy person, and I go around to all of the art stores and I buy up all of the easels, all of the canvases, all of the paint brushes, and all the paint, right? So for you to make your next masterpiece, you have to come and knock on my door and say, you know, I don't have a lot of cash, I'm just a struggling artist, but I really want to create, I really need to paint, right? And I say, okay, come on in. I'll set up the easel for you. There's all the paints. Come in and paint your masterpiece. And you come in and you say, great. And you paint some extraordinary, wonderful, beautiful thing, right, that everybody agrees is just absolutely great. And then I come in and I say, that's fantastic. That's wonderful. Give me that paintbrush for a second. And I sign at the bottom my name. And I say, okay, great. This is an original Bollinger, right? I'm going to go sell this. And I sell it for $1 million, right? And everybody can't shut up about what a great artist I am, right? And I keep all that money for myself. And you come to me and you say, how could you do that? And I say, now, wait a second. Show me one thing over there that doesn't belong to me. I own the paints. I own the canvas. I own the everything, right? All that stuff belongs to me. Why would you think that is the creation of anybody but me? And it doesn't matter that it's your creativity and your hard work that turn those raw materials into something that's beautiful and everybody wants to hang on their wall. All that matters under capitalism is who owns the stuff that went into creating. And that I think offends us. That makes us say, well, that's wrong. Well, from Marx's perspective, exactly the same thing happens whenever people at some Chinese factory somewhere spend all day constructing an iPhone. And then Apple comes along, stamps her name on it, and sells it and keeps all the profits, right? The people at Apple are not the ones creating the thing that we all want. It's the workers that are creating the thing that we all want. And yet the workers are paid absolutely as little as possible, a pittance, and the profit from the iPhone is all to the benefit of the people who are higher up in Apple, right? And the shareholders of Apple. Look at how many people are getting rich off of Apple for doing zero work, right? And again, it's not like this is some dirty little secret of capitalism. This is capitalism. This is the dream, to make massive amounts of money off of somebody else's labor. And Marx thinks this is absolutely twisted. It's a perverse system. It's perverse, just as perverse as feudalism, perverse in a lot of the same ways as feudalism. And the same thing is going to happen to capitalism that happened to feudalism. Feudalism, remember, failed because there began to be this friction between its different social classes. Well, what happened with the nobility and the peasants under feudalism, Marx thinks is bound to happen, if it's not already happening, between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat are working to create the things that people want, and the bourgeoisie are keeping all of that added value for themselves, right? Just because under capitalism, the capitalists own the ways of producing anything. They own the land, they own the factories, they own the equipment, just because that's how the system is set up. Well, Marx thinks this is a clearly unjust system. This is clearly a perverse system, and it's going to go the way of feudalism. It's bound inevitably to fail. Someday the proletariat are going to realize that they are the ones who are really in control here. There's more of them. They are the ones who are doing all of the labor. They are the ones keeping this system going. They are the real engine of the system. And so when they rise up and decide that they're not going to take it anymore, that they want they want more and more of the profits. They want the ability to own things without the permission of the capitalist. The system is not just going to change, Marx thinks. The system is fundamentally flawed, and it's going to have to be destroyed. So what happens next? Well, Marx thinks what happens next is communism. And let's talk about that. So before we get to the communist system that Marx thinks is inevitably going to follow capitalism, let's talk a little bit about life as a proletariat in the capitalist system. This is very important for Marx and for what follows. Marx is, he's a German philosopher, but he spends a lot of his adult life in London, in England, and in the middle part of the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution. And if you want to be really, really cynical about capitalism, there's no better place to be than London in the mid-1800s. This is the same era, same time and place that Charles Dickens is writing a lot of his novels about how horrible life is for the working class in London during this era, right? This is the absolute pits for people under capitalism, and it's easy to look at what's going on in London during this time and think, well, maybe the working class was better off under feudalism, right? So what's happening in London at this time is that there are the large swaths of the city that are just a giant slum, and that's where the working class lives, right? And every day they shuffle in to spend their days working with dangerous factory equipment at the factory, right? The guy who owns the factory doesn't know how to work any of the equipment, God no, lives off in some giant house, don't call it a castle, up on the hill, far away from the working class slums where his workers who create all of his products live. This is a time when there's no minimum wage. If you don't like your job, go ahead and quit, and we can replace you with somebody just as good for the pittance that we pay you. Labor unions, any whiff of that, and we'll just fire everybody again and get new people in, right? This is dangerous factory equipment. We don't care if you're injured. If you're injured, get out. If you lose an arm in our factory, well, we just throw you out. We get somebody else. In fact, a lot of this dangerous factory equipment, it takes very small arms to get way back in there to fix something. So maybe what we need to go down to the orphanage and get some, 9-year-olds, some underfed 9-year-olds, to come down here and fix our factory machinery for us, right? And if, hey, they get sucked into the machinery and mutilated or killed, well, where are you going to find another orphan in London, right? There are just absolutely no rights for the workers during this time. They live in absolute squalor, and they are the well-to-do in London at their little parties. They look down on at the slum and they say, well, look how those people live, right? They live in filth. You give them a little bit of money, and what do they do with it? They go and blow it on liquor, or they go and they blow it on gambling, right? They don't feed themselves or feed their children, or take a bath. They just you try to give them a little money, try to make them better, and they just blow it, right? To this, Marx thinks, well, all of the things that we associate, all of the negative things that we associate with the poor working class, we associate with them poverty, diseases, crime, we associate addiction with them. All of these things, Marx thinks, can be explained because of capitalism. He thinks that the capitalist system creates workers who feel helpless. They feel exploited because they are exploited. They feel alienated from the fruits of their labor. Remember, I said that Marx thinks that the ability to work and see the benefit of our work immediately and how it improves the lives of the people around me and how it improves my own life, this is necessary for human beings to be well-functioning, right? Psychologically, spiritually. Marx doesn't really believe in the spirit. He's a materialist. But he thinks that for us to be well-functioning human beings, we need to feel an attachment to our labor. And the capitalist system is built around, it understands in a way that the proletariat doesn't. The capitalist system understands that you need to degrade labor. You need to make the laborers feel like they're worthless and replaceable. And what we see is one move after another under capitalism to do this. Look at factory assembly lines, right? 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, say 110 years ago, when cars were new, right? A relatively new thing. What you would do is there would be, and it still happens with some manufacturers, but small group of people, maybe 10 or 20 people, would build a car. They'd build the whole thing, right? They work on it all day and to assemble it and make it perfect, right? And then when they sold it, they would see it drive off the lot, and they would feel pride in the fact that they pitched in with their team to build this miraculous thing, right? Flash forward just a couple decades later, and what do you have? You have this mass assembly line, right? Where no small group of people is building a car. Instead, you have just this long system of people who are just sit all day and do this. This is what they add. They tighten a screw, right, on a car. Right, and when that car rolls off the assembly line, all the money goes to Ford. You feel like, as if you're a worker in that factory, you don't feel anything emotional about that because you didn't build that car. You just turn screws all day, right? You don't understand the contribution that you made because your contribution is being minimized and it's being degraded. Marx thinks that what this does is this kind of system creates this feeling of helplessness and despair in the working class. So what happens? Well, the working class then feel like nothing they do matters. They feel like their lives are meaningless. They feel like all the only way they have to make the world a better place through labor is being stolen from them. It's being degraded, and what's left over is being stolen from them. And so Marx thinks it's perfectly natural these people feel despair, and that when they get a little money in their pocket, they go and try to anesthetize themselves from the pain of existing by drinking themselves to death or gambling all day, or finding some other menial pastime. Right? Of course they don't take pride in themselves. Of course they don't take pride in their community. The capitalist system doesn't allow that, Marx thinks. And this is a key issue, because Marx thinks that all of the problems, again, all the problems we associate with poverty and the working class are the result of poverty, or all the problems, I should say it more clearly, all the problems we associate with the working class are the result of poverty. Right? It's the result of a kind of poverty that is forced on them by the capitalist system. It degrades them, it demeans them, it tells them that their labor is almost worthless and interchangeable with anybody else. If we can fix the system, maybe we can eliminate poverty. Maybe we can eliminate crime. And that's just what Marx has in mind, right? Marx thinks in the same way that feudalism failed and capitalism and gave birth to capitalism. Capitalism is doomed to fail, and it will give birth to a new system he calls communism. What is communism? Well, communism is going to be a system that results from the proletariat rising up and taking back the means of production by force if necessary. They are going to destroy the bourgeoisie. They're going to destroy the capitalist class. There is no longer going to be this capitalist theory of property that one person owns something and reaps the benefits of that in perpetuity, even if he doesn't know how to work it, even if he doesn't work at all. Anybody who wants to, work on his land or work with his machinery has to deal with him first. Proletariat is going to throw that out. What we need is a new concept of property. The new concept of property for Marx is going to be the attitude that whoever can work with it, whoever can improve it, gets it. They get to work with it. That people need things. There will be people to provide them for them, right? From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That if you need something, there are people to provide it. And if you can provide something, there are people who need it. And you give it. You work to give it. This is going to be under capitalism. I'm sorry, I had to switch to red. I ran out of black ink, or black magic marker ran out. Under communism, we're going to have a classless, stateless society. There's no longer going to be two classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is going to rise up and destroy the other class. This will be a dictatorship, then, of the proletariat. The proletariat will rule now and forever. Marx thinks that this is the end of the cycles of systems rising up and going through crisis and falling. That communism will be the final state. Some people refer to this as the end of history, right? And this will be a system in which the workers control the means of production. The workers themselves will directly own the factories. They will directly own all the equipment. They will directly own the land. No one will be allowed to just sort of hoard things, to just sort of own land and make money off of the fact that you just own stuff, right? That's the very idea that Marx wants to destroy, right? And it's important to understand that under this system, Marx thinks that this system is over and above whatever kind of politics we have going on in our society. That politics, Marx thinks, political systems are really just window dressing. They're really just the handmaidens to the economic system, and that politics are really going to go the way of social classes, that eventually our communist society is not going to have any need for political systems. It's not going to have any need for government, really, that people are just going to get along. They're going to understand that their community comes first. They have a place in that community, that they give to that community, and then the community will give to them, right? And you might say, well, hang on, if there's no government or no police, then what happens if there's a crime, right? Well, from Marx's perspective, crime as we know it today is going to be a thing of the past. Crime as we know it today exists because people don't have the ability to get the things that they need by working for them. People need things, and the things that they need are denied them by the capitalist system. Once people have all they need, once people understand that the community exists to help them, and they exist to help the community, there will no longer be this sense of alienation. There will no longer be the sense of alienation that leads to people to commit crimes and engage in criminality. Okay, it's at this point when Marx starts saying that communism is there's not going to be any crime in a communist society. It's at this point that a lot of people give him side eye, right? Say, really? From Marx's perspective, the skepticism that we have about this claim, well, that's just capitalism talking. You think, if I may speak as Marx for a second, you think that it's just natural that people want to kill each other and take each other's stuff if there isn't a government or a police force there to make them obey the law and make them stick in line, threaten them, throw them in jail, right? If we don't have that, then there's just going to be chaos. People are just going to be killing each other in the streets. And from Marx's perspective, that's just a myth. That's a myth and whose interest does that myth serve? It serves the capitalist interest. Capitalism benefits from workers being afraid of each other, the working class fearing each other and thinking that we can't exist without their institutions, without their police. Marx. One way to think about Marxism is that it's dealing with a question of how you take the attitudes of an agrarian tribal society, take the attitudes and values of an agrarian tribal society and transfer those attitudes to an industrial nation, an industrial modern nation. Because look at an agrarian tribal society. You're not going to see in a small tribal society. You're not going to see strong institutions. You're not going to see a police force that's walking around sticking their nose in everybody's business and cracking people on the skulls whenever they get out of line. You see people whose behavior is modulated by the fact that they feel this immediate moment-to-moment connection with the other people in their tribe or their community, and they're born into this experience of every day being confronted with the fact that they have a certain job to do, and if they don't do their job, people die, and vice versa. If the people around them don't do their jobs, well, then I'm going to die, right? So everybody needs to pitch in for the good of the group and your own interest, right? People who are raised in that kind of society with those kinds of attitudes they self-regulate. They don't need a police force walking around scaring them into, frightening them into not obeying the laws. Furthermore, a Marxist would point out that, it's not like, America, it's not like America solved the problem of crime, right? We have a system of capitalism with police forces walking around, cracking people on the skulls, throwing people in jail, finding criminals and warehousing criminals in prisons. And have we solved crime? Have we made our society safer? Well, not really. In fact, we need more and more prisons to contain all of the criminals that we have. That's kind of the opposite of coming up with a great capital solution to crime, right? On the other hand, I don't know. I had a friend a long time ago who fancied himself a communist, and he and I were talking about it one day, and he said, we'd live like communists on a desert island. If you were stranded on a desert island with 20 of your friends, you would live like a communist, right? Everybody would pitch in every day. You would do what you need. If somebody needed your shoes, you would lend them your shoes. And if you needed your shoes back, they would lend them back, and so on, right? Everybody we'd live for each other, right? And my response to this was, well, yeah, but I don't live on an island of 20 strangers. I don't live on an island of, with 20 friends. I live in a nation of 350 million strangers, right? And I don't trust people to look out for my own interests. And so I have to look out for myself. And yes, we all pay lip service to community being very important, but in our American society, we are sort of taught that, community is important, but not as important as you, and you're taking what you need for yourself, right? Again, Marx thinks, well, that's just capitalism working. That's just the capitalist attitudes that have been sort of inculcated into me. But I don't know. It's hard to get past, right? And it's hard to take the trust fall that, well, all we need to do is destroy capitalism and install a communist system, and then poof, there will be no more crime. And it doesn't work that way, right? It's been clear, and it was made clear in the 20th century. There were a variety of nations that began to take Marx's theories very, very seriously, and began to install countries with laws meant to steer the people in their society away from capitalism and towards a Marxist system, towards a communist system. Now let's say something about that. First of all, let's get something straight about terminology. We commonly use the word communism to refer to nations around the world, from the former Soviet Union to modern-day China and modern-day North Korea and Cuba. We call those communist nations. Technically, they are not communist nations, at least not in the way that Marx uses the word communism. Communism is going to be the end state. It's going to be the final step in this process. And no nation has really taken that final step yet from Marx's perspective. So there has not really been a communist state per se yet. Instead, what we have countries, depending on how literally or seriously they take Marx's theory, we have various states of what's called socialism. Socialism is a socioeconomic system that's meant to be a kind of bridge state from capitalism to communism. Marx realized that we can't just wake up tomorrow and have all of these people who were raised under capitalism for generations. We can't just have them wake up tomorrow and have no government and everybody owns everything. They don't have the mentality for that. What we need to do is we need baby steps. We need a system that gradually, systematically retrains people in forgetting the capitalist mindset and adopting a Marxist mindset. Right. This means destroying all of the old institutions, all of the old attitudes, all of the old philosophies, the religions, everything else that we associate with capitalism. Realizing that all of the attitudes and values that we have within a capitalist system are essentially capitalist, and that we need to throw them out, forget about them. All the things that are important to you now, they don't really matter, and we need to replace them with good communist values. And this process of sort of retraining, this might take a generation, go back 100 years. This might take a generation, it might take 2 generations, it might take 10 generations of socialism. But eventually, the people are going to be able to enter the communist utopia, the communist final state, right? our terminology tends towards calling countries that take that communist end state seriously, just calling those communists, right? Marx would call none of the nations we have in the world communist, right? So now is the usual time in class where we say a little bit about politically how this has worked out over the past 100 years. Hi, Seamus. Beginning with first of all, the attendance password for today is marker, because my marker went dry. Marker. Anyway, so historically, how has this worked out? We said that about 100 years ago, a lot of nations of the world began taking Marx's theories seriously and trying to transform their political systems to more closely resemble what Marx had in mind. How has that worked out? Well, you don't have to be a great historian to know that it hasn't. Results have been mixed at best. And it's not for lack of trying. I mean, if you had to boil down the 20th century to the most important political question of the 20th century, I think a good candidate for that would be the question of, well, how can you make Marx's theory work in a modern society? And lots of different nations have tried lots of different ways to make it work. The problem has often been that part of the process, part of socialism that Marx suggests, the socialism that Marx suggests, requires that there be a period of time where, again, all of our capitalist values are destroyed, and this is going to take. What this will require is that there is some period of time where a group of Marxists control every aspect of our lives. If you turn to the last page of the textbook or the text that we read for today, Marx goes through a checklist. He goes through a list of things that he says, well, I don't know how to enter this communist promised land, but there needs to be this socialist state in between that transforms our values and transforms our political institutions into communism. How is this going to work? Well, he says, I don't have any great, I don't have any panacea. I don't have any silver bullet, anything that's going to work in every case. But he goes through a checklist of things that that he proposes. A nationalization of banks, the publicization, the bringing of into public ownership all of the means of production, all of the factories, all of the land, the development of the land, the consolidation of all political power, and all the into one small group of people who are going to be the ideological Marxists, right? And this sounds like a totalitarian state. This sounds like a state where a small group of people control every aspect of people's lives. They control every economic aspect of their lives. They control what they eat. They control where they work. They control what they do with their time. They control all of the propaganda, all the literature, all the media. They control everything and guide all of the media to be pro-Marxist and anti-capitalist, right? Because again, there's a process of trying to retrain us mentally, right? Now, this makes a lot of our blood run cold, in part because of our capitalist attitudes, but also in part because we have the benefit now of 100 years of people trying to make this work in the Soviet Union, in China. Well, China. We'll put China on this hand. In the Soviet Union, in Cuba, in North Korea today, in Southeast Asia, in places like Cambodia. We have a lot of horror stories of pro-Marxist governments taking control of a society and brutalizing that society. right? Because they're built into Marxism as this idea there has to be a totalitarian state under socialism, right? Communism is, or this communist project has faced some a lot of problems over the years. The one of the biggest political problems is that, well, once the totalitarian state, the totalitarian socialists are in place, they're controlling every aspect of people's lives, they're brutalizing people if necessary, they're carting people off to re-education camps, maybe they're even killing people who are too intellectual, maybe people who have reading glasses, like they did in Cambodia and in China during the Cultural Revolution, right? You have a smaller group of people gaining absolute authority and being absolutely authoritarian. And if those people aren't in an active moment-to-moment process of trying to lead us to this communist promised land, well, then really all we've done is we haven't progressed from capitalism to communism. All we've really done is we've reintroduced a particularly ugly form of feudalism. And that's kind of what the Soviet Union appeared to be at the end, that you have, instead of the king and the nobles ruling with absolute power, you had this really complicated system of bureaucrats who nonetheless wielded absolute power over the people in their society and kept all of the good stuff for themselves, even while the poor people would starve to death, right? How you make this transition from capitalism to communism work remains to be an open question. Arguably, the most successful Marxist nation is China today, right? Of course, Marxists would recoil at the suggestion that China counts any longer as a good Marxist nation. China's answer is one of the big questions you have under Marxism is you have the question of, well, if we don't have industrialists and wealthy capitalists to create stuff and to create infrastructure and to if we're not taxing them for the public good, where does our infrastructure come from? Where does our money come from? How do we pay for anything, right? And this is a long-standing, how do we pay for food, for that matter, right? So this is a long-standing problem with Marxism, one that the Soviet Union ultimately failed to answer for itself. China's answer to this question of how you get a good base of money to pay for, to help the people and make the lives of the average people better, is that Chinese communism experiments with having limited capitalism, in effect, with having not exactly free markets, but allowing certain kinds of industrialists to make a lot of money. And China over the last 20 years billionaires have sprouted up all over China. And the idea is, well, if we allow some people to own stuff and basically be capitalists, we can tax them and take some of that money back and make the people in our society better, right? Make their lives better. Even if you think that China is a successful socialist nation, a lot of ideological Marxists, not to mention capitalists, will point out that, well, the success of China is really only explained by the Chinese experimenting with these limited zones of commerce, right? So maybe not a great example. So okay, well, I think that is all I have to say for tonight. So okay. I will talk to you guys later.